Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Stories of the Raksura by Martha Wells. This is the fourth-ish book in the books of the Raksura. I have read these out of order. There will be spoilers for the other books in this series, in this review. I'm sorry. But this is basically 2 novellas and 2 short stories. And I'm going to sort of treat them as 2 books just in the same review, because that seems like the best thing to do here. The first novella is The Falling World. This story takes place not long after Moon returned to Indigo Cloud after the Siren Depths, the third book. Jade is going on a diplomatic visit to another Raksura court to establish trade with them. Moon has stayed home for once, because the politics of the Raksura culture would mean his presence on this trip would look bad on Indigo Cloud Court, so he just stays behind. And he's fine with being left behind until he finds out that Chime will be going as well. And that means all the people he's closest to in court will be gone for, a few weeks. Chime is going specifically because he's hoping this other court they are visiting might have some knowledge of the odd transformation he went through, changing from an Abura Raksura into a warrior. And he's hoping that they might know something of the strange way his magic now works. Moon is left just waiting for them to come home. But then a delegation from the court shows up, claiming to know nothing of Jade or her entourage. Moon, Pearl, and the others know something went wrong, and with no one else they could possibly send, Pearl agrees to let Moon and Stone lead a mission to find and rescue the missing queen and her warriors. They expect to find betrayal by the other court, an accident, or an attack by a dangerous predator. What they actually find is significantly weirder. So, because I primarily read novels and not really short stories or novellas, when I am reading anything shorter than a book-length work, my mind is almost always circling around the question of why isn't this a novel? And usually that's because there just isn't enough material for a full-length book in the story. But for once, I feel like with this particular story, The Falling World, there was enough material for a short but novel-length book. And Wells just chose not to write it that way. She could have spent more time with Moon and Jade and Chime before they left, especially with the setup of Chime's search for answers and Moon's response to it. She could have spent more time with them exploring the Mountain Thorn and the Fallen City. We could have spent several chapters in exploring the spell, learning what actually happened. But Wells chose not to write that story. And though I can think of plenty of places that we could have seen expansion, for once, I don't feel like that expansion was lacking. Like, I did not find myself wishing that this was a novel so I could have gotten the complete story. This was a complete story. And, honestly, what this sort of reminded me of is... So, one thing that this series has done throughout a couple of the books is there are random tag ending extra adventure bits at the beginning or end of the story. Things that, actually needed to happen for the overarching series, but were not actually super important to the events of the book it happens in. The one that's most obvious in my mind is the moment that Moon is temporarily kidnapped by another queen as a political plot for her court. It appears in the end of Serpent Sea, and it has nothing to do with the particular book. It has a huge import in the overarching series, but it has nothing to do with the Serpent Sea. And there were a few of those moments in this series, and this story sort of feels like it originally was one of those, and then Wells realized it didn't fit in the book. So it had to go somewhere else, and it ended up just being a novella on its own. And honestly, I think that was the right choice, both because it's too long to just be an additional element of another book, but also it would have been a hell of an off-point tangent. It would have been completely unrelated to the story it would have tagged onto. And also, just frankly, it's a complete arc, and it can stand on its own as a story. So, why shouldn't it? I'm probably the only one wondering why it's not a book, and that's just because that's where my mind automatically goes. My only annoyance with this short story is I would have preferred something explicit on the cover to mark that, yes, this short story should be read between the Siren Depths and the Edge of Worlds. But overall, I liked the story a lot. It's got a very Martha Wells kind of flavor to it, with lots of fascinating settings, weird world and cultural elements, lots of mystery, and intense focus on characters' emotional struggles. And this is an interesting stop on Moon's emotional journey. For so much of the series, his emotional arc is about him feeling out of place and othered, and slowly working his way towards feeling like he has a place. And I mentioned in my review of the last two books in the series that some of his emotional arc in those two didn't work for me. Suddenly, he seemed to think of himself as a completely different person than he had in the previous books. Someone who very much does have a place, and one that he fits really well, but the events of the story were asking him to step out of that place and he wasn't comfortable with it. And that is so different than the arc that we saw in the earlier book. But The Fallen World, this novella, bridges that gap. This is where we finally get to see him very much in the between. Still hyper aware of the ways he doesn't fit the place Raksura culture would put him in, but also beginning to see himself as a true Raksura consort and wanting to, just be that. And yeah, he wants to be an unusual one. He knows he's never going to be the normal Raksura consort, but he sees himself very much fitting the role. And this novella helps me see his entire arc across a series more clearly, and it makes it feel a little bit more connected. I will say, I feel like this story does not quite juggle the story with the extensive setting descriptions that Wells loves so much, as well as her longer books do. There's both too many words spent on beautiful emotive descriptions, but also somehow not enough straightforward descriptions of setting. I would know the place we were in had lots of dark, moody light and sharp thorns and spongy, mossy ground, but I was still not sure if we were on a branch of the mountain tree, a platform built on the branch, or something else entirely. Also, in a novella, it does start to just feel overwhelming when so much of the wordage is spent on setting description. But I thought the plotting was actually really well handled. I tend to find novellas and short stories anticlimactic. Either there's not enough time to build up to make me care about the climax, or the build-up gets too much time, and there's literally just not enough page space to really have a powerful climax. But this one actually had just enough time spent on the build-up for me to be really invested, and then enough action, and weird enough action, to feel like it was a climax. It could have been a bit more action-y with the beast. There's a bit of a deus ex machina that felt a little bit too convenient, but otherwise it never left me feeling unfulfilled, which is one of my biggest complaints with short stories and novellas. My only other thought about this one is really the fact that because this is a novella and not a full-length book, all of the things you need to remember from previous books, exposition at the beginning, felt really obtrusive and heavy. Wells is usually much better at stringing it out across the entire work and keeping it subtle enough that you aren't feeling like... if y'all ever read Babysitter's Little Sisters, the fact that there was a chapter at the beginning of every single book that explained what a divorced parent relationship with families meant, it was in every book, and it was almost word for word every book. And to me, that is the most obvious of things you need to remember from previous books exposition. And this one, of course, is nowhere near as bad as that, because it's not Babysitter's Little Sisters. But the important thing is here, a lot of it was a bit distracting and felt very in-your-face exposition. But yeah, I really like this story, and I don't tend to like short stories, so that to me is a good sign. And then we move on to the next short story. The second story in this book is The Tale of Indigo and Cloud. And it is a lot more like what I expected to find in a book of short stories that is part of a series of novels. This is fun, this is great, this does not majorly impact the arc of the series. There was no problem at all for me to have read the rest of the series and then picked this one up as dessert. All the elements of the story that would be pertinent to the rest of the series were thoroughly explained in the main series. Because of that, I also feel like this is the only short story in this book that could be read completely as a standalone story. Like, if you found this in a literary magazine having never read a Raksura book, you could read this one with almost as much enjoyment as I got having read 5 books in this world. This is the story of the pair that Indigo Cloud was named after. Indigo is a young Raksura queen who was sent on a trading mission to Emerald Twilight Court. When she comes home, she is carrying with her a consort that does not belong to her, Cloud. She admits she stole him, which is one of the biggest crimes Raksura queens can commit against another court, but she claims that she did so at his request. He is the consort of a very young queen who clearly thought better of the commitment once she had claimed him. Now Indigo's court is going to have to deal with the fallout, which could lead to several queens' deaths, or even an almost unheard of war between courts. And I liked this story as well. It was fun. Because we got to see entirely new characters here in a much more traditional court, we got to see a lot more of what Raksura culture looks like. Like, Indigo Cloud court that we follow in the bulk of the series is going through one upheaval after another, and 3 of our 4 main Raksura characters are not really living traditional Raksura lives. Like, Moon grew up outside of Raksura society entirely. Chime's position as a mentor who changed into a warrior is so rare it's almost unheard of, and Stone has reached the age that he is able to do pretty much anything he damn well pleases. But these characters in The Tale of Indigo and Cloud are living very traditional Raksura lives. Though I noticed Wells couldn't help but throw in that Cloud was raised a bit more wild than most Raksura consorts, and so he's a little bit outside. But even the conflict of the story is one that is fully steeped in the complexities of Raksura culture, which just made it a fun way to explore some of the nuance of the society that we have yet to look at. But it did make me even more hyper-aware of how much the queens and consorts dynamic is just the traditional hero and princess dynamic reversed. Like, here in the Raksura culture, the males are the delicate, gentle ones who are mostly concerned with relationships and having babies, while the females are the strong leaders who fight over pretty consorts. And honestly, I'm fine with that. It's okay. Like, sometimes it's fun just to see, like, dynamics we're used to just straight up reversed. But it does make Cloud sort of come across as, like, a not like other girl character. Like, he's the not like other consorts. And, like, that's fine, except for how often it appears in fantasy novels. And I will say, Moon never came across as a not like other consorts, because his character was thoroughly introduced to us before we even found out what consorts were supposed to look like, or act like. So he was just Moon before he was a consort. But other than that, I thought this was a really strong story. Though I honestly felt that the random bit at the end that more thoroughly tied it to the rest of the series felt a little forced. I would have preferred just to let Baby Stone be the only representative of our main series leads to appear in the story. But I love the fact that the story really focused a bit more on the violent parts of the Raksura culture. I loved the nod to the Fel Raksura connection, which would be such an important element of the main series without it being a major part of this story. Overall, I just enjoyed it. But the last 2 are short enough that I feel like it's best to talk about the 2 of them together, and they are The Forest Boy and Adaptation. So they are both prequel stories to the main series. The Forest Boy is a story from when Moon was a child and was traveling the 3 worlds, just trying to find a place he could fit in. And Adaptation is the story of the day Chime first shifted into a warrior instead of an Abora. Overall, both of these stories definitely felt like extras. Like, they are not even listed on the cover of the book, though the other 2 stories are. They are both significantly shorter, and honestly, they're a bit more like what I think of when I think of short stories. Like, they were fun to read, but I wasn't exactly super invested in either of them. Now, part of that is just that they are both stories that you know how they are going to end if you have read pretty much any of the books of the Raksura. Like, spoilers here, but we know that Moon did not grow up with this nice couple that takes in orphans, and we know that Chime is going to have to learn to live as a warrior. But also, they just aren't super high-stakes stories. I mean, yeah, The Forest Boy does include one life-threatening scene, but it came and went very quickly, and with very little real feelings anyone could be seriously hurt. The stakes of the story comes down to, will Moon be accepted? And because it's from another boy's point of view, the true arc is, will this other boy, Turn, get over his jealousy? And it's a sweet little story, but it's all about the emotions, and because it's from a child's POV, those emotions feel both sort of distant to an adult reader and just a little bit immature. And I will be honest, I'm not sure she fully captures the child voice here. Specifically, I'm not sure what age these kids were meant to be. Like, sometimes the voice sounded very young. Like, a lot of times I was thinking 7 or 8 at most. But there were other moments, passing mentions and of responsibilities and growing up, that felt like more like she was meaning them to be 11 or 12. But I couldn't put my finger on what age they were meant to be. And overall, it very much read as an adult writing kids. And even though, yeah, there are very few books out there that are written by kids about kids, but I feel like a good book written from a kid's point of view makes you forget that you're reading the words of an adult. An adaptation was one of those stories that, to me, read as if there just wasn't enough story to be a story here. Like, it was fun. I enjoyed the characters, but the tension was off. Like, if you've read even the first story of the book, like the first Raksura book, the Cloud Roads, you know that Chime turns into a warrior and stays that way. So the only tension is how he will be able to get to the point of accepting it. And he just sort of does. Like, I feel like this story would have been a great B-plot in another story. But as is, there's just not enough action for it to really feel complete. These last 2 stories, they were fun to read, but mostly just because after reading 5 books in this series, this felt like running into old friends and having them tell you about their day. Nothing in these stories was a big revelation, though it was nice to know for sure that when Chime changed, his appearance in both forms changed. That was cool to know. But nothing in them majorly changed the character arcs or the overall series themes. They were dessert, not dinner. And they were only a mildly fulfilling dessert. But, like, I do think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm not overly fond of short stories. I do also think that, especially because these are all in the same collection, it got really annoying getting the same exposition over and over again. Like, by story 3, we had gotten the explanation of the 2 types of Raksura 3 separate times. Not even counting the fact that almost anyone who picks up this collection is going to have read other books in this series, and therefore would have had to explain to them in each of those books as well. So you've probably gotten the explanation at least like 5 times before you get to the story. But presumably, these stories were originally written to be published in literary magazines as standalones and other collections separately, so that wouldn't have been a problem in those situations. Also, I will say, because I found the last 2 stories a bit underwhelming, I do wish the order they had appeared in the book was different. Like, I think it would have read as a much stronger collection overall if we started with The Falling World, then got The Forest Boy adaptation, and had the story of Indigo Cloud come last. But overall, yeah, it was a fine collection. I enjoyed it. Varying levels of importance to the overall series, varying levels of emotional impact, but I'm glad I read these stories. Though I still very much wished I had realized that these 2 collections should have been read before the last 2 books in the entire series. But yeah, other than that one flub in reading order, solid collection.